Hey, welcome back to CPAC 2022. We're here on the grounds in Media Row having conversations with friends, and I'm joined this morning by Hudson. He's the recent author, or author of the most recent book, The Desecrators, co-authored with Matt Schlapp. Hey, Deal, welcome.
Ryan, thanks for having me on.
Hey, I'm so honored that you stopped by.
I'm a big fan of Liberty University.
Well, me too, and we have that in common. And also want to hear about this book, but I also want to talk about just your experience these past couple of decades in the political world, obviously with the Catholic Church and engagement, but anything you want to talk about.
Well, I am a former Southern Baptist minister, Ryan.
Are you?
Yeah, I was president of the Baptist Student Union at the University of Texas in the early 70s.
Are you kidding? So I'm
Yes.
I'm a UT alum. I'm a Longhorn.
Wow.
School of Economics, and I was a part of the Baptist Student Union in the early 2000s.
Well, I'm glad you walked in my footsteps.
Yeah.
And when I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, I started a Baptist Student Union at the university there.
Oh, wonderful.
As well as a mission church.
Okay.
The Southern Baptist Convention.
Okay, very good.
So I owe them my knowledge of the Bible. Believe me. And then when I went to Atlanta for my doctoral studies, I was an associate pastor at Druid Hills Baptist Church, which was famous back then because the ex-pastor was Louis B. Newton.
Okay.
A very famous figure in the history of the Southern Baptists.
Wow. I don't know Louis. I should know.
Well, he's
Louis.
dead.
Okay.
But
I've not heard of Louis. So this is
well,
news to me.
he's like a famous from the 30s and 40s.
Okay.
Way
Okay.
back.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about this book, The Desecrators. I'm interested. We're in cancel culture. We've seen works out there like the 1619 Project, this sort of deconstruction, dismantling, if you will. We're also seeing, by the way, deconversion, right? Everywhere you go, critical theory, cynical theory, the way in which people want to take things apart, including the fundaments of society, right? The things that make us a cohesive nation, culture, right? A common language. All of these things are being torn apart. And our heroes, our forefathers, we're now, they're being vilified and right before our eyes, and history is being retold, reimagined, remythologized before our very eyes.
Are you sure you haven't already read the book, Ryan?
I have not read the book, but this is a needed book. So I will tell you, I think at least I know where you're going with it.
You're getting there. And
yeah.
I would say, let's start with history. And by the way, the reason we called it the Desecrators is because I didn't want to call it cancel culture or wokeness. Matt and I decided we wanted to give a name to what all these people had in common. Where were they coming from? What were they fundamentally trying to do? They were trying to destroy or desecrate all the things we hold sacred, beginning with God, beginning with monotheism, beginning with the notion of there being God's law, one true God, one sex, male and female, one sexuality, and also a natural law that we carry in our hearts that naturally leads us toward God, that all people are searching for God even if they don't know it. An attack on the family, which is the natural God-given place, crucible, where human life develops from conception. All these things we hold sacred, including our patriotism, our nation, which has its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And you use the word deconstruct. That's a philosophical term. And as a former philosophy teacher, I'm glad it's become part of our general discussion, because deconstruction means is another way of saying desecration. Think about it. Christianity is founded on one thing. It's founded on the incarnation of Christ into human history. It's based upon the 13 years of his earthly life, on his creation of the church, on the work of all the disciples. Those are all historical matters. They were talked about by non-Christian historians such as Herodotus and others, So what are you doing when you cancel history? You're canceling the basic fundament of God's revelation to us, upon which all Christians, regardless of denomination, have their faith. So the idea of canceling culture, of deconstructing history, is all directly anti-Christian, anti-Jewish.
Mm-hmm. I think of something that Alexander Solzhenitsyn said: he who controls the present controls the past, he who controls the past controls the future. When you think about the philosophical process of deconstruction, there's a praxis, there's a moment in which that which is philosophical becomes actualized in the methodology and the pedagogy of teaching in schools, right? Curriculum. Right now, if you go on CNN or if you go on any of the mainstream news media, they'll bring on experts, legal experts, and they'll tell you that critical theory cannot be taught in schools because it's such a scholarly work. It's way over our heads. Yet, if you go to any Barnes & Noble, if you go to a public library, you'll see in the children's section all kinds of books about transgenderism, about the LGBT movement, and also about skin color, and highlighting all of these disordinate differences that everyone has. And to celebrate those things, but in the way that is actually not cohesive, it's divisive, and yet we're being told, and being lied to rather,
exactly,
that this doesn't exist.
It's all lies. Now, another good example, Ryan, I'm sure you've thought about this, even talked about this, is multiculturalism.
Yes.
I was teaching in the classroom at Mercer University when multiculturalism hit. And it became clear to me very early, this wasn't an authentic attempt to bring in other voices we haven't heard, which was a good idea. I mean, anytime you have authentic greatness in culture, we should know about it. This, behind multiculturalism, was an attempt to quash Western great books, the Western tradition, the foundation of Western Christian civilization. This was not just about, let's include people that have been excluded. This was about destroying great books programs, core curriculums. Now, we can't read Plato and Aristotle anymore because they're white men during a period in which Greeks owned slaves and so forth, and thought of women as having less rationality than males. So multiculturalism is a great example of the lie you're talking about.
Yeah, I had a pastor, friend of mine who's in Canada, and he told me that when Canada, in the social reforms that took place in the 60s and the 70s, they introduced multiculturalism. So to sort of get rid of the Christian hegemony that had reigned in Canada for such a long time, and introduce multiculturalism. And in these social reforms, the culmination of that led to 1982 reorganizing Canada's constitution so that their Bill of Rights was no longer about a pre-political right that was absolute in terms of free speech, freedom of thought, freedom of assembly, and they basically lost religious liberty in 1982. They didn't lose it during the lockdowns. They lost it in 1982. And it's up to the judiciary to decide what is most important. But multiculturalism replaced the Christian hegemony. And because of multiculturalism, essentially, if all equal, everything is treated equal, nothing really is, if that makes sense.
Of course,
they supplanted it.
Need to care about ideas, Ryan.
Right.
Now, I congratulate you. You started talking about ideas from the very beginning of our discussion. Christians need to care about ideas. They need to care about what's going on at universities, colleges, high schools, and most of all in educational associations and among academic book publishers, right? And I've been talking to Christian groups since I was 20 years old. As president of the Baptist Student Union, University of Texas, I was even younger. And whenever I would talk about an idea, you could sort of see people's eyes roll back. Now, if I made it biblical, then they would sort of tune in. And that's good, they do. But once you get beyond that, you talk about the world of ideas in Marx or Hegel, and Hegel's really one at the bottom of this desecration. Because Marx was a Hegelian. I mean, what Hegel did was he made God identical with history. And what you see among Catholic bishops is this, and I even seen it said by Pope Francis, is that if God is the same as history, that means God is in a progression.
Yes.
God is actually growing toward his absolute form.
Yes.
Which means that anything in the future is better than whatever is in the present or the past.
That's right.
So these people that among Catholics who start talking about future church, this is all based upon Hegelian guidelines of the loss of transcendence, the loss of the supernatural, the idea that we as human beings are actually creating divine absolution.
Yes.
Absolute in God.
Yeah, that basically was the German liberal project. And ironically enough, this is where critical theory sprung out of. It's also where liberation theology sprung out of. And the Hegelian dialectic and dialectic materialism was what Marx was influenced by.
Right.
And so what's interesting is Deal, as I'm looking around, Hegelian synthesis in terms of this process of history is something that I would really warn people about. It's like, well, what does that mean? It's this idea of merging some kind of alien philosophy that is dangerous, and that's just how it gets rooted into society, but it's some kind of an alien orthodoxy or alien theology that is brought in that actually destroys the old and supplants the old. But it's presented as though it's merging with the old. There is no compatibility with this new anti-racism orthodoxy and actual Christianity, but they're trying to present it as though this is exactly what Jesus taught.
Yeah, and there's no factual basis either. I mean, I was born in 1949. I grew up in a segregated part of Fort Worth, Texas. Went to Arlington Heights High School. I grew up in a segregated world. D.L. Hudson, had to overcome that. I had to learn from Martin Luther King.
Yes.
I had to learn from Frederick Douglass. I had to learn from experiences of encountering black people and understanding, you know. So once I got to my 50s or 60s, I was feeling pretty good about the United States of America in terms of its growth toward racial equality, racial understanding, harmony. And all of a sudden, Barack Obama got elected president, and I started hearing that, well, we're still a racist country, we've not made any progress, we've gotten no further. And of course, now with Black Lives Matter, we are finding out that as white, we are racist and always will be racist. We can't get out of it. We can't do anything to avoid the racist label.
That's right. There was a propaganda campaign that started in 2008, 2009, and it was an experiment in reflexivity. The idea that the press, the media, could create a crisis and speak it into existence. And so I call them, whether it's race baiting or necromancy of the sins of the past, calling up the old sins of the past, raising them up, right, so that we could slay them all over again. But you're right. What Frederick Douglass, I'm glad you pointed him out, because what Frederick Douglass wanted to ultimately do is point to the foundations of society and say, these promises are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. America didn't live up to its promises. The idea is not to burn everything down, but to go back and remind ourselves, call ourselves back to the original standard. The original standard did not make way for slavery. In fact, 9 of the 13 colonies originally had banned slavery prior to 1776. And so the reality is that this was a movement. It was largely within the church. It was expressing itself also politically in the same way the civil rights movement. While 100 million people were dying in Russian gulags, during the communist reign in Russia and then also in China, here in the United States we had a religious civil rights movement that was changing this country. It did not come politically. It was largely vetoed politically. The Civil Rights Bill in 1957, right? Vetoed by the Senate Majority Leader at that time, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and yet this movement was happening in churches. So it's very interesting. We've come full circle.
Ryan, you just demonstrated the power of knowing history.
Yeah.
You just demonstrated the power. If people like that, when they go to their parties and dinners and all that, if they just knew what you just said, They could just knock the libs dead. I'll give you another example, 1619 Project.
Yes.
It states that the U.S. Constitution, the United States itself, was founded in order to protect slavery. Wrong, a lie. Why? If you go back to the Constitutional Convention, most of the members were opposed to slavery, as you just said. Most of the states had already outlawed slavery. How did the Constitution actually get passed? By giving certain southern states a pass on slavery for the time being. Everybody knew it was a contradiction to both the Declaration and the Constitution. They all knew it. And the southern states also knew their time was going to come when slavery was either going to be outlawed or there was going to be a war, which there was. But this was all foreseen by the members of the Constitutional Convention who were opposed to slavery. And this was the biggest battle in Philadelphia at that convention.
That's right. It's truly incredible. I want to talk then, real quick, your book, the title again is The Desecrators.
You remember that, Ryan?
Yes. Where can we find it?
You can find it everywhere that you can buy books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, tanbooks.com. And the thing about it is, what we do in this book is we give people hope. Now, part of the hope we give them is what you've just demonstrated. That if you educate yourself historically, educate yourself about some basic ideas, you don't have to be a philosopher, you don't have to be a theologian, you don't have to be an intellectual, just some basic notions of what liberty is, what human happiness is, what human rights are. As you said, they're pre-philosophical, pre-ideological. They're given by God, our own declaration. They can't be taken, right? These kinds of things will give people the ammunition they need to win arguments and also the confidence to stand up in public and say, I disagree and here's why.
Very good. That sounds like a revolutionary concept.
It shouldn't be, but it is.
We need to get back to that. There's been a great awakening in this country, and there needs to be a great awakening. We need to recognize, as you said, these are pre-political. They come from God, not from government. And freedom is ultimately God's idea. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom.
Freedom is ultimately God. In other words, we are only free when we're in God's will. We are only free when we are doing God's will, when we are following His law, when our virtues are based upon His charity and the faith that He's given to us. Freedom is being directed toward our true final end. Freedom is not being free to do anything we want. Freedom is knowing we shouldn't do certain things.
That's right. That's right. I've said this to Michael Knowles over at Daily Wire, but yes, we have a free will. The question is free to do what?
Correct.
And really
big difference between the two.
Yes, huge difference. Well, Deal Hudson, thank you for joining
Ryan,
us.
thank you.
Thank you for this book, and really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ryan.